Thank you for staying with us. As I said earlier, our next conversation is about mental health. We're having our mental health conversations. We focused on men, we focused on women, and now today we're speaking about children and about youth. And the only person I know who can do that well is Camille M. Quamina. She's a clinical psychologist. Welcome, Camille.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you
Morning,
for being
everyone.
here. Thank you for joining us. All right, so we're going into this conversation about children and youth. Now, we've been seeing a lot of reports, and it's not something new. It's been happening over the years, over time, where children bear witness to crime, whether it's the killing of their family member or the family is robbed or something in that nature along that line. We
Yeah.
want to know, how do children process these things? Because we know as adults, we have issues processing it. So how do our children fare in this scenario?
Yeah, I mean, it is different for children. It's the same type of trauma. So, in the same way that an adult experiences trauma, it's the same exact way that a child experiences it. And what it really is trauma is really any situation that's life or death. And when you think about crime, it's this violation of somebody's rights. It's putting them in this life or death situation, even the children.
Right.
And they are sort of forced to navigate the emotional disturbances that come from that. And the main difference between adults and children are primarily how we process. And it's important to remember that children's brains are still developing up
Yes.
until the age of 18. It's the reason why we have laws like, you can't drink before a certain age because, for example, alcohol interferes with a developing brain. And that can also cause some serious problems. So the brain is actually developing up until 18, and that accounts for a major difference between adults and children. And to give you an example of it, if I take this cell phone and I throw it at you as an adult, you're going to probably have lots of feelings and thoughts about it. And
Right.
all of them will revolve around me throwing the phone at you. If I throw the phone at you as a 10, 11-year-old, your first thought is going to be, what did I do wrong? And that's because children perceive that the world revolves around them. So whenever there are crises or anything that happens in a child's world, it's so important to guide them through it because they are going to assume that they've done something wrong. And that's where the first impact can kind of happen.
Wow. I think that's so important, what you said there about, them taking these feelings and internalizing it and blaming themselves. Because I was going to ask you, how does witnessing these things affect their behavior? But now you're saying also it affects their self-esteem.
Of course, yeah, it affects their self-esteem in the long term. So I would say there are two ways that crime can really affect, especially children. In the first instance, you have the short-term effects. So you have the immediate upset, the inability to focus, the sleep being affected, nightmares, anxiety increases. And then in the long-term effect, something really important happens during our childhood. Essentially, the way that you and I are now starts in childhood.
Right.
And how that starts is that we begin to, from the experiences that we have, formulate the answer to three questions. And the three questions are, who are we? How are we supposed to relate to the world? And is the world safe or not? And so based on our experiences during childhood, we answer those questions, and then that sort of forms the lens to which we view the world. So a good example is if you and I are walking on the road and we fall in a pothole, and I begin to cry hysterically and you begin to laugh. Really, is falling in the pothole funny or is it sad? It's neither. What happened is we both sort of process that, internalize that based on the answer to those three questions I was telling you about. And we had a reaction based on our answering of those questions. So in the long term, what really happens is, of course, kids learn the world isn't safe in the most scary, nightmarish way. And then that affects how they think they're supposed to relate to the world. So then we have adults, they grow up, they have adults who distrust them, they don't trust people, they think life has done them duty. You have these beliefs that have formed at this crucial stage of life that can really affect their ability to function in society later on.
Right. So if
Yes. Sorry.
So if unaddressed, these things could affect your behavior, your lifestyle, the choices that you make. How do we begin to address these things? What kind of intervention is needed in cases where children would bear witness to the loss of a loved one through crime or loss of things, anything that's traumatic. How do we begin to intervene in these cases?
Yeah. So I think child appropriate conversation matters. So a lot of times we tend to not be truthful with children. We think they can't take it. We think they are unable to understand, or we need to hide things from them. But while they interpret the world differently, so they do think the world revolves around them, they have the same emotional capacity as adults. So they're feeling the same things, they just are doing something totally different with it.
Right.
So in a situation like that, it becomes so important to speak with children. You need to sit them down and have a conversation with them because they have experienced a crime. They have witnessed something that's gruesome and graphic, and it would be abnormal to feel nothing about seeing something like that. Mm-hmm. So they are going to feel what they feel. So a lot of times it really is doing the responsible thing. It can be hard for the adults and the caregivers to try to manage their own grief, their own trauma, and then help these kids through it. Mm-hmm. So I would say if you feel like you can't do it, definitely seek alternative solutions or alternative persons who can carry on these types of conversations with the children. We have a lot of free resources in Trinidad and Tobago through victim and support. You can go to the Children's Authority to be able to access some help with, helping these children process it in the first instance through conversation.
Okay. I want us to go into, therapy and what that looks like for children. But before we go to that, could the same be said for children who grew up in a household where criminal activity is the norm? They grew up seeing, loved ones engage in criminal activity, and that's kind of celebrated in a way. That's the lifestyle. Do these same effects happen to them?
Yes, it is very possible. Of course, we can't predict 100%, but it would be the same thing as if you're growing up with parents who value academics. So whatever your parents tend to value, you learn very quickly. If your parents value academics, you're not going to bring a bad grade home. And if you do, you're mentally preparing yourself for your wrath that's about to be unleashed, right? It would be the same thing in a home where the values are slightly different. So in a home where a person is involved in a gang or they may be into drugs, there is a value on what we would say the criminal element or the, abnormal sort of social element. And when that becomes valued, there will be some contrasting information. So when the children go to school, they are going to see that their peers are different. They're living a different life. They're doing different things. But that doesn't necessarily translate into my way being maybe something is off with the parents, because like we were talking about earlier, children think the world revolves around them. So even when they notice those differences, it can be quite upsetting because the first thought is that, okay, so what's wrong with me? How come this isn't working out? Right. And then when you start to think along those lines, I think it's natural to gravitate towards the persons who are, imposing the values on you or teaching you those values. And so it can actually draw you closer to those value systems because it's where you fit in and it's where you get rewarded when things go well, even though when things go well, it's not necessarily in a law-abiding way. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, definitely. How can external parties such as the school, religious bodies, community groups lend support to children in both scenarios? Children who grew up in households where criminal activity is the norm, or children who have now experienced something traumatic because of crime?
Yeah. So I think it's very important for these types of institutions to acknowledge it. I think a lot of times we don't acknowledge that there are children that are experiencing these things and we sort of skirt around the issue. So I think something like even a class once a week where we talk to kids, we let them know this is what is going on in the world. You are going to have choices to make. Sometimes the persons who have titles to you are going to do the things that feel wrong. They feel like, not good things to do. And it's okay to believe yourself, reach out, speak to somebody else. So I think education in the first instance, putting the information out there on that, yes, some of you are going to experience this. And yes, this is not legal. This is not healthy for you. And these are your options basically are important, especially in schools that are in areas where when the kids leave, it's in their face. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right there around now.
Yeah, definitely. From a national level, what do you think based on your expertise and your opinion, what do you think needs to be done? What more needs to happen? Whether it's intervention for this or even in terms of before it happens, preparing the children, but from a national standpoint.
Yeah. I think, interestingly, even from a national standpoint, we can do something like that in the schools straight through. And I think that can be something that we can actually make a curriculum sort of endeavor where it's mandatory. Some schools have religious instruction, so even in denominational schools have a denominational religious instruction. You take, your instructor based on your religion. And we can do something like that within the schools as it pertains to social well-being, especially when we know our figures in crime are so high. Yeah. And so, address that in the long term, because this is a long-term mechanism where we're really targeting the generation that's coming up to ensure that they are able to do things a little bit differently when they get bigger. So the interventions to me really have to come in terms of education, in terms of options, in terms of knowing that it's okay to be different from your family, or it's okay to not want to do those things, or to acknowledge that you can love them, but that they may still be. So it's really giving kids the information to process complicated and very intricate sort of adult situations.
Yeah, definitely. Without giving too much away of your process, what would therapy for children entail?
So we can talk about the process for sure. Because I always find, Dominic, it's better for people to have an idea what they're signing up for, because it's very hard. Therapy is not an easy process, or else everybody would be walking around here healed and happy, right?
True.
And it's just up such stuff that it can be very difficult to sometimes stick through the process. But therapy for kids can look a little bit different from therapy for adults. There are many different types of therapy for kids. There is, for example, play therapy. So that's a type of therapy where you come in, there are lots of toys, and when the kids begin to get down into play is really where we see what their world is like, because kids sort of mimic their reality even when they're playing. So that's one example of therapy that can be done with kids. With kids, it's a little bit different because they are extremely transparent. So they really tell you what's going on at home. And it's really, are you listening? Are you not listening? Is really what it comes down to. But they're very sort of show you what they're feeling. Another really important thing with kids that can be helpful to the therapeutic process when they come in is that their behavior is usually an indication of the emotional disturbance. So that also allows their process to be a little bit more targeted, because kids are sort of very transparent in that sense also, where usually if there's a behavioral problem, there's some emotional disturbance happening, and that's the first place that kids sort of show up difficulty processing something that's bothering them. So there too is your sign in sort of, addressing the behavioral or delinquent behavior on any level.
Okay. In terms of persons, wanting the services, they're looking at this now live or, later on, and they want to find out more. They're not sure if therapy is right for them. Even if it's children who may not have had something as traumatic as that, but there are issues that you're seeing coming up and you want to seek help for your children. How can persons get in touch with you? Where can they find more information or contact you to learn more about the process?
Sure. So I am on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at Camille M. Quamina. You can also email me, camilleMquamina@gmail.com. My phone number is 495-6285. So you can shoot me a WhatsApp or give me a call. And I also have a website, CamilleQuaminaTherapy.com. So you can check out the social media and website. That's what I would do first. See, because there's a lot of information there also. So read it, see what sticks, see what works. When you're starting the therapeutic process, it's important to find a therapist that you feel comfortable with, because a lot of this process is based on trust and rapport.
Right.
And if you feel like you can't trust your therapist, or you all don't have rapport, or you're not pulling, that's all right. You may just need a different type of therapist, and it just requires a little bit of looking in the first instance, but you're doing that for you to feel comfortable. So I think it's important.
Yes. One more question before we wrap up. How can a parent or guardian support a child who is in therapy? So the child may be doing therapy alone. It may call for them to do it alone for a bit. How can that person, not being in the room, support the child during this time?
Yeah. So there is a little bit of letting go that needs to happen, because your therapist is going to let you know. If there's some crisis situation that's happening with the child, the therapist is not going to keep it confidential, and the therapist will let the child know this also.
Okay.
And so there's no need to worry that there are major crises happening, because you will know. But it's really about trusting the process, and I think letting go a little bit also allows children to know that you have confidence in their ability somewhat, and that can help with their self-esteem, because it allows them to know, okay, yes, I can do this. And, mom is supporting me in the sense of allowing me the space to be and to feel, while, or mom or dad, and letting me know that, they're here if I'm having a hard time.
Right.
So I think a big way of supporting is just making it comfortable to have that gray area or the in-between. Because that period of therapy is not healed, and it's not, it's sort of this in-between process where you're now kind of starting to figure things out, and that doesn't necessarily feel good, and delinquent behavior doesn't necessarily stop during that time. So
Right.
it's a bit of patience in that gray area while we move from one stage to the other.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much, Camille M. Quamina. Thank you. This has been our mental health conversation. We take a short break. When we come back, we have lots more in store for you. Stay with us.